Well, hello there again, everybody. This is UXW Bill with another somewhat computer-related video. I'm a big fan of cheap little wireless routers that are capable of running third-party firmware, such as dd-wrt or even something like Tomato. Now, there are a lot of alternative firmwares out there to choose from, and very often they give some major advantages over the stock firmware that comes with your wireless router. If you're willing to take a little bit of risk and flash firmware to a router that's provided by a third party, which technically invalidates your warranty, you can oftentimes take these little $40 to $80 routers and not only increase their reliability tremendously, but you can also add features that are only seen in equipment that costs many thousands of dollars. Anyway, most of the time this goes pretty well, and although the first one that people do might be a little bit nerve-wracking, once you get one successfully flashed to third-party firmware, it's pretty much smooth sailing from there on out, and the capabilities of these things are greatly extended. Well, I've put out a lot of these things over time in my work as a freelance computer consultant to replace a lot of fallen routers or ones whose firmware never quite measured up to what it should have been or wasn't as reliable as it ought to have been. And in particular, I love these little Buffalo routers. These things are just amazing, the stuff that you can do with them, and there's a lot of them floating around out there. Well, I've done about 50 to 75 of these things and never ever had one come back with any complaints. That's just how good it is. But there's a first time for everything, and this is a Linksys WRT54G version 5. This was the version of this particular series of router where Linksys drastically cut down on the amount of flash memory, cutting it in half from 4 megabytes to 2, and also cutting in half the amount of working memory, or RAM, from 16 megabytes down to 8. They also changed the operating system on these from a Linux-based offering to a proprietary VxWorks-based offering that, to be charitable about it, really wasn't as reliable as it could have been. And so the open firmware community adapted, and there is actually open firmware available for these cut-down routers with lessened amounts of working and storage memory. So anyway, those of you who are familiar with this and have been down this road already will know what I have done to this poor router. This is a brick. This thing, there were versions of this router that were sold with the actual full 16 megabytes of memory, and so after I'd finished flashing alternative firmware, in this case dd-wrt, to this thing, I decided, well, I'll have a shot at enabling that memory by setting up some special flags for the bootloader to process when this thing is first powered up. Well, turns out I got the model number wrong. This thing doesn't actually have 16 megabytes of memory, it only has 8. But now it's got a bootloader that's reading in a parameter when power is first applied that's making it think it does. Well, when there's that kind of disparity between reality and what the processor is told to do when it starts up, a lockup is the result. This thing is completely dead to the world. There's no activity from the wireless. There's a blinking power light indicating that booting can't proceed, and all these switch lights are on over here. So this thing has basically reached a point where it's impossible to do anything with it through normal means. It doesn't even get far enough along in the boot process to manage to come up to the point where you can issue a hard reset and clear the non-volatile memory that stores all these parameters. Now you could take this thing out at some point and just go hog heaven on it and break it and smash it into little pieces, but any of you who are watching this channel knows that's not my style. If there's a hope of saving anything, I'm going to at least try. And there is a hope for these things. Most any wireless router ever manufactured, as well as anything that uses a system on a chip, has some special functionality on the board that you may not even realize is there. In this case, that special functionality is called a JTAG port, for Joint Test Action Group. JTAGs are typically used during the manufacturing of a device to download the first revision of firmware that is ever to be loaded on it, or to do a basic assurance test and make sure that the onboard microcontroller and its memory and all its related subsystems are basically functional. But the JTAG port, JTAG, has another use, and that can be used if you can find and populate the connector on the board, which is right here in the case of this WRT54G version 5, you can use this to intervene and to communicate with the microprocessor when all the normal means of communication are completely unavailable. But of course, you need to populate that connector. Well, the good news is that the connectors themselves are readily available on eBay or even at electronic parts retailers if you know what to ask for. This sort of header style connector, in this case, this one has 12 pins on it. Anyway, when you get your connector, you have to solder it to the board, and then you also need a ribbon cable assembly to actually try to talk to the router's processor so that you can flush the non-volatile memory or try to reprogram the firmware with something valid if it's been programmed with garbage or the programming failed. These cables, you can make one yourself. The pinouts are available, or again, you can get them for a couple of bucks on eBay, which, because I didn't feel like taking the time to gather a 25-pin connector and the shell and the ribbon cable and all that stuff, I just went ahead and bought this on eBay for about $5, which really, you know, compared to the time and traveling I would have had to do to make my own, wasn't such a bad deal. Anyway, now what I've got to do is actually solder this connector to the board, and then I'll be ready to try and talk to this router and clear the NVRAM, which should be all that it needs to spring back to life, because when I clear that, it'll remove that invalid flag from memory, and the firmware on this thing should be able to boot properly once again. Alright, well, I stand corrected apparently. I thought these were the JTAG ports over here, but it turns out I'm wrong. Those are actually serial ports. Over here is the JTAG connector, which has now been populated with a set of pins that the ribbon cable can be plugged into, making sure, of course, that pin 1, the part with the red stripe, is plugged in the right place. Now let's get a computer over here. Now for this, you're going to need a computer with a parallel port, and from what I've read, a real parallel port is required. USB adapters won't work. Sometimes those legacy ports, they're mighty handy, and I definitely get more than a little irked when I see a computer in my possession that hasn't got at least some legacy ports. Now it's time for the software part of the equation. So here's the setup basically ready to go. I've downloaded a JTAG communications program, the Tornado JTAG version 3.0 utility, which is available on the dd-wrt pages. You may find other utilities that do what you need, but this is a commonly used one. Now before you continue with this, because you're getting further and further from the point where any safety nets exist, and you're actually diddling with the microprocessor on your router directly, as well as your valuable flash memory and things like that, you should definitely seek advice on a forum where people are knowledgeable and can help you debrick your equipment. Otherwise, you may royally brick it. Follow every instruction you're given, and be careful. Don't take chances. That said, I've done those things, and now it's time to go ahead and blow away the non-volatile memory on this thing and see if it'll go ahead and boot up afterwards. So here I go. Now if this is a successful run, the Broadcom microcontroller on this little Linksys router should be recognized immediately, and then the memory should be cleared. So here goes. And in this case, that has definitely happened. So it's probably time to go ahead and power cycle this thing and see if it'll go ahead and boot up using the firmware that is on it. Alright, I've gone ahead and unplugged the JTAG cable because I shouldn't need it anymore, but the pin header can stay there because it might come in handy at a future point. Let's power this thing up and see if it's a little bit happier now. It's not making good contact. Oh, that's the wrong power brick. Looks like it's coming back to life. It's presently booting up, and the switch lights are no longer stuck on here. The power light just went on solid. So did this other light over here, so it definitely appears that it booted up. Might as well slap it back into the cabinet and get ready to configure it. Yep, it's definitely re-entered the land of the living, and everything is well once again. Woohoo!